Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. In fact, I was in Tena maybe a month and a half back with Damien and to see the beginnings of your wonderful biennial and your project. And my friends Dharmendra and are also there. And I met Joannes also. So thank you for inviting me. And it was a fascinating talk I just heard. Um and I come from a very different socio-political context, and a lot of my work is based here. And my practice has been a crossover between environmental activism and environmental policy and art. So I speak from that perspective. And so I will, if I share my screen, oh yeah, I can, 1 second. Uh, I'm not sure you can see my screen, can you?
Not yet.
Not yet. See it.
Yes.
Now, now it's there, right? You can see a slide.
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to a lot of my work has been about uh, looking at nature from an environmental justice perspective and a social justice perspective, and at relooking at what we see in a different way. And so I had planned to just take you through two landscapes. One as something I've researched and thought about for a long time as part of my environmental work, and second, as an artist researcher, another landscape I explored over a few years uh, with the fishing community. So I had written a piece about this in recently published a piece. So I will also read a bit um, just to be able to say everything I need to say in a short time. And it might sound a little formal, but please bear with me. So a picture you see is of a landfill in Delhi, and of course landfills look very different in Switzerland and in parts of Europe, but the concept of the landfill is the same. And the materials there are not necessarily local, they are global, and they follow a global supply chain. But the conditions and of how they look and what they mean and how they are just posed in a health and hygiene format that landfills have to be managed. And I want to think beyond that in terms of that landfills are not just a framework of health and hygiene, but really connote a very deep part of our capital structures. So there's a small short piece. It's part of a long piece I'd written. So I'm just going to read a short piece from that. It is an archive of the city, its landfill of waste. Gargantuan and overflowing, the decades-old dumps are a location of biopolitics, science, equity, nature, culture, and the ignored non-human. As a site of entanglements and an assemblage of worlds of commodities, it is capitalism's heterotopia, hidden from view in its interstices, but without which capitalism cannot exist. Waste cannot be seen in isolation from our ontological and epistemological relationship with nature and cultures. To think of waste sustainability is to shift our positions vis-a-vis nature per se. The landfill is a messy assemblage of materials and non-materials. The waste in one is like a hyperobject in Timothy Morton's terms, a non-value and a marker of commodities as they decay or transform as outcasts of capitalism and globalization. Wastes are entangled with a plethora of gases, toxicities, waste pickers, bacteria, animals, technologies, international treaties, and so forth. Systems of ethics, justice, relationships, legalities, and behaviors are encompassed in them, and materials which form waste end up in the non-places of landfills. Coming from elsewhere, they transform local ecologies to non-nature, an accumulation, quote, an accumulation without metabolism. In fact, landfills mirror the larger world they inhabit because in collecting goods, and again, quote, in collecting goods and people from around the world, Capitalism itself has the characteristics of an assemblage, unquote. In this post-enlightenment age of human exceptionalism, landfills and wastes are markers of the Anthropocene. The landfill is a wasteland, a space that figures as the antithesis, the absolute other of civilization. No one except the non-human and the less than human, scavengers, waste pickers venture here, a disgusting place of rot and toxicity. Owing to industrial and military histories, some have been made barren, contaminated with deadly chemicals and radioactive materials, or have been turned into burial sites for disposed weapons. Many are beyond redemptions. Their hazardous nature is not in the public knowledge, causing harm to those who use these sites. In the United States, a few are classified as Superfund sites, requiring massive, exorbitantly expensive, and almost impossible cleanups. Those storing mercury, nuclear waste, and the like are often out of sight in deep salt mines or even on the seabed. Once located on the outskirts of habitations, many landfills are now in their midst, often in the poorest neighborhoods, increasing risks to those living there. Such wastelands are among also along riversides, in old mines, in cities, even on ships. And now the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and other ocean gyres contest the term landfill itself. They are, to paraphrase Walter Benjamin's description of Paul Clay's painting, Angelus Novus, the debris of progress. A commodity culture infuses landfills. What ends up here has passed through institutionally and technologically determined consumer behaviors which valorize cleanliness and efficiency according to social and legal norms of waste separation, collection, and disposal. Consumers, though, have little knowledge about the earthly origins of these commodities or their post-use trajectories. Economic values which facilitate nature's entry into capital markets have eliminated all other forms of its worth. Such a commodification of the world is rooted in human society's alienation from nature. When this state is prolonged, violent displacement results and commodification is exasperated. And we see a lot of this in Europe. The Clean Europe is based on a high-cost collection system of all kinds of waste, but we don't know where it lands up. No consumer know, and a lot of it lands up across the world. From landscapes of entangled and complex ecosystems, nature converted to the category of the other has allowed its abstraction and extraction into raw materials. This stark separation goes right to the heart of the man and nature divide, where even the possibility of understanding another ethos seems remote. On the other end of the spectrum, our cultures or materials are considered part of local ecologies of life support systems, and I'll come to that in the second part of my talk. Here, they're not materials, but part of relationships of coexistence. When extracted, they're done so with an ethic of care and reciprocity. Indigenous communities, for example, take from nature only as much as they need, not more. Plants are not uprooted, instead, their roots are left intact so that they can provide again another kind of identification with nature is another kind of identification with nature is evoked what the kind of a kind of ontological self what kind of ontological self does an indigenous person inhabit when she claims that she is the land and not on it? Karen Barad, the philosopher, writes, practice of knowing and being in are not isolable. They are mutually implicated. We don't obtain knowledge by standing outside the world. We know because we are of the world. We are part of the world in its differential becoming. The separation of epistemology from ontology is a reverberation of the metaphysics that assumes an inherent difference between human and non-human, subject and object, mind and body, matter and discourse. So I'm suggesting that more than just solutions which are locked in current frameworks, we have to question the very framework of what nature is. And a lot of my thinking and work has been on that sphere. Materials thus alienated from their moorings, cultures, and meanings start their journey to end up in a landfill. As anthropologist Anna Singh writes, alienation is that form of disentanglement that allows the making of capital assets. Capitalist commodities are removed from the life world to save as counters in the making of further investments. Thus, too, alienation makes possible accumulation, the amassing of investment capital. With such vast chasms in ways of being, the violence accompanying material extraction is unseen, let alone atoned for. A reconfiguration in the form of multi-layered ecological relationships would also entail a shift towards an ethos of humility, respect, reciprocity, and cooperation, rather than the exploitation of a dominance of nature. New materialism scholars like Barad have proposed an ethico-onto-epistemological shift. She defines ethics as being labor responsibility and accountability for the lively relationships of becoming of which we are a part. The landfill is a symptom of a larger malaise. It is a sign of things that have gone terribly wrong elsewhere. And so these are just some images of of waste flows, global waste flows. This particular image is of the relationship to waste, purity, pollution, and caste in India, which is very much like the idea of race. Uh, and some of you might be familiar with this. Certainly, my Indian friends there would be familiar with it. And these are some trends on waste generation, despite all the talks we have in all the COPs and UNEP, and having participated in UNEP conversations for several decades now, personally, till finding that it really doesn't get us anywhere. We find that both the extractive economies are increasing, not decreasing. Despite climate change talks, plastic production is increasing, global flows of waste are increasing. So I just wonder, what exactly are we doing when we're trying to remedify the situation through all these treaties? This is a picture of global waste, e-waste flows, which happens around the world. This is another work well, I don't normally call it work. It's a collaborative um, exploration when I was drawn into a fishing community in south of India, near in the state of Tamil Nadu of the Bay of Bengal, and I went there casually and got drawn into uh, ex- talking to them, finding the ways, examining the ways, researching with them for over 3 or 4 years, and finally, this body of work, which is called "Else Will Be Still," is speaking about some of these issues. And of course, the basic question I ask is the sea I see, the sea he sees? When we look at something, what are we looking at? Is it a common idea of nature? It is something which uh, not produced through different cultural and hierarchical social positions? So I'm going to uh, now next from my diary of this work, I'm going to read small sections of it. Uh, his father was a fisherman, his grandfather too. He learned to swim in the ocean. Soon he learned to walk. Fishing was second nature to him, and the sea his first home. He could make catamarans, which is called catamaran. Incidentally, the word catamaran, which is a local boat, I'll just show you, comes from the word catamaran comes from catamaran. So catamaran has its roots in a Tamil word of 2,000 years ago. He could make catamarans or catamarans, repair them, oil them to protect them from termites and borer insects, and sit on them legs astride and dangling in the water, paddling far out in the sea. He could read the waves, see their color change, and know when the sea was not welcoming. He could predict a storm looking at the skies, and a sense when a school of fish came close to shore. If that happened, in a flash, he would take off and cast his net, no matter what time of day it was, and even if he had already paddled for hours before that. Fishing was his livelihood, but it was also something he loved, the thrill of it. Each morning, an hour before sunrise, he would push his small boat over the waves and jump into it as it crossed into more calm currents a few meters on. Here the waves lapped and seemed still, but the waters were deeper and the current stronger. Above all, he claimed he could swim even 10 kilometers in case he needed to. The sea was not a place of fear, it was home. A bigger boat he would have liked. That's a catamaran. A bigger boat he would have liked if he could afford to share in one. Enterprising as ever, He found odd jobs during the day as he got displaced from his fishing in the many homes which outsiders now owned along the seashore. He was trustworthy and honest, and they could trust him with the keys while they were away. He spent the afternoon cleaning the houses and tending to the gardens. Occasionally, he would receive a phone call informing him of a pending arrival of a homeowner or his guest. He had found a way to survive in this new economy and also keep his fishing income alive. It was more than what his children wished for themselves. His son wished to be an engineer and his daughter to find a decent job somewhere. It was probably the end of the fisher person's life with him. He ensured his son did not learn to swim. He actually ended up learning to swim, but he didn't want him to. While some of his neighbors prospered with investments in bigger engine driven boats, and also through those who invested in the businesses, fishing as a livelihood seemed to be a dying one. It would survive, but as a business, not as a livelihood. Uh, I'll come to that last image. A big hall in a distant hall land. People in suits and smart talk and legal important looking papers all over. Heads of states and scientists huddled together as well meaning NGOs watch. I was often one of them. No fishermen or poets were allowed. It is a crisis. Everybody looked worried. The sea was rising. Probably Vishnu, one of the major Indian deities, had begun his churning. Or the ocean serpent was restless. Everybody seemed to know, but no one knew what to do. The planet was under threat. Its future was at stake, and the humans were responsible. The climate was changing. A limit had been reached. But why did no one tell the fishermen who went out every day on the rising ocean, or even asked him what they saw and thought of it? This was no place for non experts. Science, too, had its informers, its experts. The beach, this is on technology, lined with boats. There are two distinct types, those with outboard engines and long propeller shafts, rudders, and others powered by broad wooden rectangular paddles. Power and propulsion depend on who owns them and the economic status. Access to technology is not democratic. Capital overshadows labor. For some, it is eternal labor. There is no escape. The flat, human-powered boats are now made of fiberglass. A decade ago, they were made of softwood. Merely 6 long pieces of wood lashed together with rope, and then 3 more of upturned wood to form a keel. Impossible to sink, heavy, soaked with water, but no repair was required. Today they lie scattered around beaches, broken, unused as junk, disuse and despair, and in disrepair, replaced by industrial fiberglass post-disaster, post-tsunami, along with the diesel engine. Two propelling devices, two economies, one boat costing a mere 15,000 rupees, 200 euros, or another rupees 15 lakh rupees, 15,000 euros. With the diesel engine, a big net, the figure could go up to 25 lakh rupees or 25,000 or 20,000 euros. Technologies allow selective access to the sea. A small boat travels 2 kilometers in, while the powered one over 20 kilometers every day without fail. The fish catch is bigger, the net trapping everything that moves, fish as well as non-fish. The smaller boats have to be content with the smaller catch, leftovers, maybe worth 200 to 300 rupees, 2 to 3 euros daily, if that. When the seas are rough, the small boats stay at home. Technology in the form of diesel engine is changing the landscape of the village. Technology and capital have come together to change the idea of ecology itself. From a lived reality, ecology has become a desired space. Those who have the money can aspire to the nature experience. The fishermen only live on, off, and in it. The port. There is a new port nearby, desired by politicians and others who wanted to be known as the modernizers of a sleepy coastal town. It was built despite all reason. No one asked the fishermen. Possibly, as whispers go, there were lucrative contracts hidden in the sand. Who knows? Yet the small seaside town was never a big industrial hub, nor did it have a large amount of commercial shipping. So who was the port for? However, the port was built. A huge wall and jetty were constructed. Artificial harbor. As predicted, the sand from the estuarine river close by, and it was in millions of tons each year, could no longer flow, normally deposited on the seashore to form the beaches. The fishermen lived and parked the boats on them. Without the sand, they may as well pack and go home. The port stopped the sand from flowing along with the coastal currents onto the shores. Millions of tons of sand piled up on one side of the port wall as the beaches waited and waited, pining away, thinning down. The sea eroded the beaches even more, and soon the water was lapping up to the fishermen's huts. No place left to launch the boat. And finally, uh, I was working with their language, the classical language from which the current language emerges, and this is poetry from 300 BC, now called Sangam poetry. These are some references, and the poetess, or the who on the extreme right, who introduced me to this poetry. It's very interesting poetry because it talks of a relationship with nature, which is why I got interested in it. Ancient Sangam Tamil poetry, Akam, for example, reflects such subjectivities. It relates five physical landscapes: Kurinji mountains, Mulai forest, Marotham agricultural lands, Nidal sea, Palai desert, to five interior ways of feeling: sexual union, yearning, sulking, pining, and separation. Some tribal societies inherit the planet for the future, not own it as private property. Alternate imaginations uh, and other relationships with nature can temper our actions, shifting us from certainty to creativity. Ideas about science, economies, and future need to be put on an equal footing alongside other ideas of mortality, fragility, vulnerability, balance, equity, and democracy. And this particular image is a installation I did on the site, which are words collected over time from the villager, from the fishermen, asking them what the sea meant to them. And these are the kind of functional everyday words they used, and not abstract words like the sea is beautiful or the sea is uh, stormy. So it was very sort of immediate lived idea of nature. And why these I bring these two ideas of these two landscapes up is to first bring the idea of alienation in the way we look at something, and how the planetary, I mean, there's a question which is being asked now, where is the planetary? Uh, uh, how the planetary is embedded in everything, and how we cannot see any landscape outside its planetary ramifications. And secondly, that the trajectories we propose of having a technological or even a community fix need to be really looked at very critically, because both notions of community uh, community and relationships are complex and complicated, and we are really fighting against a whole battery of a way of thinking and a uh, uh, way of being, uh, which needs to change. And uh, I think without that, the trajectories we are proposing will not have the impact of a sustainable future until the very idea of the relationships we have with what we see and how we are with the idea of nature changes. And of course, many people are thinking and writing about it. And of course, when we bring in the idea of other knowledge systems, for example, even when I bring Sangam poetry in, because in South Asia, these are communities in transition. In many other parts of the world, they already eliminated. So you have to look at the Amazon, or you have to look at the indigenous tribes of Papua New Guinea to find these knowledge systems. But here, they're still in transition. They're not completely transited. And you find these cultural ways of being which are reflecting these relationships, though fast disappearing. And I think that when we uh, when we uh, when we think about futures, we have to think about what kind of trajectories of futures we are really talking about. And I also saw when I was working with the fisher folk that the idea of agency is something becoming very, very complicated, because you can react to something, a change. You can react to somebody taking away a piece of your land, and you can go to the local court. But when everything is shifting, when everything is changing, then what is your agency for change? Who do you react to? Who do you react with? And there's a kind of helplessness and powerlessness. And what forms of collaborations, or what forms of politics uh, is possible in those? And I know TJ talks a lot about the politics of something, and I think these are things we need to pay attention to. And I think the last speaker also spoke a lot about collaborative networks of collaborations, which I think are very important to do. But can we do them at a scale, and can we do them in places where the pressures of change, which is like most of the world, most of the non-European and Western world, these pressures are enormous in a sense. So what kind of futures can we really hold? What kind of politics can we really hold? I don't have any clear answers to that. I'm just going to leave it at that so that we have time for some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi. Why? Wow, I'm just like, speechless. There is so much, and basically, I could pick up on many of those notions. The floor is obviously open to questions and reactions, but as always, while you're thinking, perhaps I would just allow myself to kind of get the discussion going. When you mentioned this project, that addresses the ways of looking, is the sea I see, the sea he sees, right? It obviously beautifully manifests and dramatizes the kind of positionality of knowledge, right? And our kind of situatedness. You mentioned obviously, some philosophy, the new materialist feminist also philosophy, and I'm a huge fan of, basically many of them, Karen Barat, obviously situatedness of knowledge, also from Donna Haraway, and so on. And I really love how many of these works that you shown kind of exemplifies how we live in this interactions, how we are realizing ourselves constantly in interactions, and we never stay outside of them. So there is nothing kind of objective, but we are always kind of trapped in those. And I wonder, what role actually art has, what limitations perhaps and possibilities are offered by art and art makers in this context, right? To kind of allow ourselves understand better the idea that we are actually never able to stand outside of these complex relationships, right? And also following up on this, I feel there is this kind of almost inward-looking character to certain projects. They are almost kind of they are being realized for perhaps art audiences or people that engage with them from the outside, but how do they actually matter for the locals, for the people whom you're addressing? Do they understand them differently? Obviously, but how and what can we learn from this? And perhaps right at the end, because I really love your philosophical approaches. Who is the artist in all this, and what's this kind of perhaps new or different conception of the artist in all of this?
So I can only answer from how I define myself as an artist. And it's hard for me to talk about every other art practice, because everybody requires their own location, because art is a all-encompassing word, and what becomes art is always a fluid question. We've gone away from the idea of formalism and form-based art into the whole idea of aesthetics as located into the idea of situated knowledge. It changes what art practice could mean for some people, though everything can coexist in an art practice. So so for me, I think art, when I have an artistic approach, it's about freedom to think about the questions I'm interested in without being bound by disciplinary boundaries. And so you go extra disciplinary. I keep my questions at hand in myself. So I go with a query, which is both local, but also with a big concern of what we are going to do next, what our futures are going to look like. And in that, I look at communities, try and work with communities, because I think that at the end of the day, it is where I find any hope of recovering something. Uh, because it is here where relationships with land or with ecology are really still existing in a way in which they have not disappeared everywhere else. We are so the landfill is one place of disappearance. It's one sort of mega site of disappearance, without which the whole structure of capitalist production cannot exist. We can never get rid of landfills in one way or the other, whether it's landfills on the ground or landfills in the sky through burning something. So we cannot. So that's one. But in the other end, there's also the question of uh, whose nature are we talking about? What natures are we talking about? Who's losing the most in this whole definition of nature? And that's the environmental and social justice question. It's very close to my heart. Saying that, what about justice? Because justice was one of the justice, liberty, equality. These are fundamental principles of modernity. This is our benchmarks for the future. What about justice? Justice is completely unserved today, more and more, because what we are offering huge communities. Fishing communities are almost 30%. Coastal communities in India are 30% of the population. So these are huge communities. What are we offering them? And who are we to offer them anything when we should be learning from them? And so I really want to point towards uh, saying we have to shift the trajectory, this technological trajectory, which is very much embedded in all our UN systems, all our policy frameworks. They're very much in fixing the problem. And fixing the problem is finding a better technology, finding better standards, doing something little less, burning less fuel. But look where we are. We're still at 2 degrees plus. I mean, look what's happening in Europe right now, right? So I don't think we're going to get there. So I think, of course, it's a big ask, but I think the shifting of the trajectory lies in the relation question of, and the relation question is both political as well as ontological in a sense. Do we have I don't know if we have the systems or the guts to go there, but I don't see, because also I relate the idea of ecological justice and multi-species justice together, because when you protect landscapes, you protect everything on the web of life in it. So when you protect, when the fishing landscape is protected by this fish, and there's so many sort of experiences and learnings from those communities, So, for example, after the tsunami, the government went and built concrete houses for them to protect them. So they don't sleep at night in the concrete houses. They go and sleep in the beach. And I asked them, but you have this beautiful house. They said, but I can't sleep. They said, we can't sleep without hearing the sea at night. I need the sea breeze in my face. I need to hear the sea. They said, look, go and sleep on the open in the sea. So we don't understand what it is they are saying. They're not saying we want a concrete house because we're scared of the sea. The sea is us, in a sense. So these kinds of relationships, I think we have, in this whole framework, we have lost, because nature has been outside the question of the social contract. How do we bring this back in, and on what terms? And so I'm spending a lot of time looking at practices on the ground, My current work is looking at what we call Dalit literature and Dalit poetry, because Dalit is like race, like environment. So uh, social hierarchies and nature questions change in a sense that for this is a long debate in the feminist discourse also, that women see nature, the tree, differently as men do because it means different things to them. We cannot take out this segmented approach when we try and recover. There's no macro nature we can talk about. These are multiple relationships. And the colonization continues. I'm saying new colonization because, of course, there was old political colonization, but these are new colonizations because the colonial mindset through which we treat nature. I don't know if I've answered anything because, you get me started, I can speak about this, maybe ramble along a bit. I'm sorry.
We have two more questions. Would you like to step up to the mic? Thank you. Thank you so much, Ravi.
Damien.
Hey, Ravi. So I was very fascinated by this approach towards the lived everyday life and the planetary embedded within this lived everyday life, right? And then you come from this very old poetry and then Dalit poetry, and you talk about humility as one of the key ingredients somehow in how to approach these planetary embedded systems of everyday life. And I think humility is a very interesting word. And the way I see the poetics of your approaches as an artist, humility plays a large part in it in a very interesting way to me as an observer of your art practice. Could you speak a little bit also, having been here and now all these artists are here, about how you would define humility as being part of an art practice which deals with the questions you raise on a much bigger scale?
So humility is still a word which I don't use very easily because it's a word of doing something, of being humble. But I think of humility as an act of listening. And for me is, do we have the capacity to listen to things we don't understand and know? And what are the terms of our listening? So very simply, I'm interested in listening to what's going on and opening up to acknowledging and listening even without fully understanding. So humility is still a kind of moral term, and I don't like using moral terms, so I would just say an act of listening. Does that help anyway? I'm saying.
Hi, namaste.
Namaste.
So my question is the conflict, does it arise in your art practice as an environmentalist? Because as you said, we feel helpless and limited. And so from moving on from one subject to another via documentation or intervention, and do you ever feel that sometimes it's conflicting for us as artists to get into the space again where we know we are just probably going to feel helpless again?
So it's an interesting question. I think that the conflict arises because there are frames through which we operate. And if we start operating in a different trajectory, then it is not a conflict. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it's how you start from the ground up that a new world opens up. And the conflict arises within existing frameworks of thinking or of action. So it means new collaborations, new understandings, new frames, terminology, new acceptances, the space for that, new practices. And I mean, there are so many interesting art practices now coming from the global South, which are very rooted. And I think that rootedness there is no place for conflict because it's its own thing. It's its own production. It's its own sculpture in a sense. So it's not about fitting. It's about starting from another set of premise. And within existing frameworks of environmentalism or artistic practice, we need to think differently what these things mean.
Ravi, thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. We have to unfortunately move on.
Yeah, thank you.